Penn Central Transportation Company filed for bankruptcy on June 21, 1970, listing liabilities of approximately $3.3 billion. It was the largest corporate bankruptcy in American history at the time, a record that would stand until the Texaco filing of 1987. Penn Central had been created 2 years earlier, on February 1, 1968, through the merger of the Pennsylvania Railroad and the New York Central Railroad, two of the oldest and most consequential rail systems in the country. The merger was intended to produce a combined railroad of sufficient scale and operational efficiency to survive in a regulatory and competitive environment that had been systematically destroying the financial viability of the Northeast passenger and freight rail industry for 2 decades. The merger produced instead the conditions for the fastest bankruptcy in the history of a major American corporation. The forensic entry point for this case is not the railroad itself, though the railroad's operational failure is consequential and instructive. The forensic entry point is the real estate. Penn Central controlled one of the most valuable portfolios of urban real estate in the United States, assembled over a century of railroad expansion that had required the acquisition of terminal sites, right-of-way land, and urban property in virtually every major city on the northeastern seaboard. That portfolio included Grand Central Terminal in New York, Pennsylvania Station in New York before its demolition in 1963, and the air rights above those terminals, whose development would eventually produce billions of dollars in value that Penn Central's creditors would spend decades attempting to recover. The bankruptcy that Penn Central produced was so consequential, so complex, and so structurally inadequate under the existing legal framework that Congress was compelled to rewrite the bankruptcy laws governing large corporate failures or its aftermath, producing the Bankruptcy Reform Act of 1978 that created the Chapter 11 reorganization framework that every subsequent large corporate bankruptcy has used. Penn Central did not merely fail, it broke the legal framework that was supposed to manage corporate failure and forced the creation of a better one. If this is your first case file from this channel, subscribe now, because every episode adds one more layer to what you are about to understand about the architecture of institutional failure. The Pennsylvania Railroad and the New York Central had been competing with each other for more than a century when their merger was approved by the Interstate Commerce Commission in 1966 after years of regulatory review. Both railroads had been experiencing progressive financial deterioration driven by the same structural forces: the diversion of freight traffic to trucks following the Interstate Highway Act of 1956, the decline of passenger rail demand as automobile ownership expanded and commercial aviation became affordable for business travel, and a regulatory framework that required the railroads to maintain unprofitable passenger services that the government would not allow them to discontinue and would not subsidize adequately to make financially viable. The merger was supposed to solve these problems through scale, operational consolidation, and the elimination of redundant infrastructure. It solved none of them. The operational integration of two legacy railroad systems with incompatible information technology, different labor agreements, different equipment standards, and decades of institutional culture that had been defined by competition with each other proved more difficult and more expensive than either the companies or their regulators had anticipated. The covenant that Penn Central's management did not read carefully enough was the one embedded in the timeline of the operational integration. The assumption that the merger's efficiency benefits would be realized quickly enough to offset the costs of the integration itself. That assumption was wrong by a margin that the railroad's cash flows could not absorb. Penn Central began losing cash at a rate that its management concealed from its board of directors and from the public markets through accounting manipulations that would be documented in the bankruptcy proceedings and that contributed to the regulatory reforms that followed the collapse. The concealment of the cash losses was not simply an act of institutional dishonesty. It was the product of a management team that had committed to a merger whose benefits it had promised to regulators, shareholders, and lenders, and that found itself unable to acknowledge that the benefits were not materializing at the rate required to service the debt the merger had required, At what point does a management team's concealment of financial difficulties from its board constitute an act of institutional fraud rather than an exercise of optimistic judgment? Leave your analysis in the comments below. The real estate that Penn Central controlled was the most consequential and most underappreciated element of the company's balance sheet at the time of its bankruptcy filing. The railroad's century of expansion had required the acquisition of terminal sites and right-of-way land in every major northeastern city, assembling a real estate portfolio whose market value at the time of the 1970 bankruptcy was substantially greater than its book value on the railroad's balance sheet. Grand Central Terminal alone occupied a site whose air rights value would eventually be established, through decades of litigation and development, as among the most valuable parcels in Midtown Manhattan. The Penn Central bankruptcy estate spent more than 20 years attempting to realize the value of the real estate portfolio, a process complicated by the railroad's continued operational requirements, the regulatory framework governing railroad property, and the specific legal battles over the air rights above Grand Central Terminal that produced the landmark 1978 Supreme Court decision in Penn Central Transportation Co. v. City of New York. That Supreme Court case, in which the city's landmark preservation law prevented Penn Central from developing the air rights above Grand Central Terminal, and Penn Central argued that the prevention constituted a regulatory taking requiring compensation, established the foundational legal framework for landmark preservation law in the United States, and determined the relationship between property rights and historic preservation regulation. For every subsequent case, the appraisal failure in the Penn Central case was not the overvaluation of the real estate. The real estate was genuinely valuable and eventually produced substantial recoveries for the bankruptcy estate. The appraisal failure was the undervaluation of the real estate on the railroad's balance sheet before the bankruptcy, which concealed the full extent of the company's net asset value from the creditors, shareholders, and regulators who were attempting to assess the company's financial condition in the years before the filing. A company with $3.3 billion in liabilities and a real estate portfolio worth substantially more than its book value should not have been a surprise bankruptcy. The undervaluation of the real estate made it one. If the forensic analysis this channel conducts is changing how you read real estate headlines, the like button is how the algorithm knows to send this case file to the next analyst who needs it. The Penn Central bankruptcy proceeding revealed, with painful clarity, that the existing legal framework for large corporate insolvencies was inadequate to manage a company of Penn Central's complexity, asset diversity, and operational importance. The Bankruptcy Act of 1898, which governed corporate reorganizations at the time of the Penn Central filing, had been designed for smaller and simpler corporate failures than a company operating 13,000 miles of railroad track, employing 100,000 workers, and controlling a real estate portfolio spanning dozens of cities. The proceeding that attempted to reorganize Penn Central under the 1898 framework lasted for years, produced multiple conflicting plans of reorganization, required repeated interventions by Congress to keep the railroad operating while the bankruptcy was pending, and ultimately demonstrated that the existing framework was structurally incapable of managing a corporate reorganization of this scale and complexity. The Consolidated Rail Corporation, Conrail, was created by federal legislation in 1976 to take over the freight operations of Penn Central and several other bankrupt northeastern railroads, a governmental solution to a reorganization problem that the bankruptcy framework could not solve through conventional market mechanisms. The Amtrak system, which had been created by federal legislation in 1970 to take over the passenger rail operations that Penn Central and other railroads could not operate profitably, was in part a response to the recognition that the Penn Central failure was imminent and that the federal government would need to ensure the continuation of passenger rail service regardless of what happened to the railroad's financial condition. The institutional denial in this case was distributed across the entire regulatory and governmental apparatus that had overseen the railroad industry for decades. The Interstate Commerce Commission had approved the Penn Central merger, despite clear evidence that the operational integration would be more difficult than projected. The Nixon administration's Treasury Department had declined to provide emergency financing in the days before the filing, a decision whose political and policy logic reflected the administration's reluctance to set a precedent for government bailouts of failing corporations. Congress had created the conditions for the failure by requiring the railroads to maintain unprofitable passenger services without adequate compensation, and had declined to address those conditions until the failure was complete. The Penn Central bankruptcy's most consequential long-term legacy was not the reorganization of the railroad itself, which was eventually accomplished through the Conrail solution, but the rewriting of the bankruptcy laws that the proceedings' failure had demonstrated were inadequate. The Bankruptcy Reform Act of 1978 created the Chapter 11 reorganization framework that replaced the inadequate 1898 procedures with a more flexible and more powerful set of tools for managing large corporate failures. Chapter 11 gave corporate management the ability to remain in possession of the company's assets during the reorganization, eliminated the automatic appointment of a trustee that the 1898 law had required, and created a debtor-in-possession financing mechanism that allowed bankrupt companies to obtain new credit to fund operations during the reorganization. Those tools have been used in every significant corporate bankruptcy documented in this channel's archive: the Caesars Entertainment bankruptcy, the General Growth Properties bankruptcy, the WeWork bankruptcy, and dozens of others. The legal framework that governs every one of those proceedings was created in response to the Penn Central proceedings demonstration of what a bankruptcy framework for large corporate failures needs to do, and what the 1898 framework was incapable of doing. Penn Central's failure was the largest corporate bankruptcy in American history. Its reorganization proceeding was the most legally consequential corporate bankruptcy in American history. Its real estate portfolio produced litigation that established landmark preservation law in the United States. Its railroad assets were reorganized through federal legislation that created Conrail and shaped the structure of the northeastern freight rail system for the remainder of the 20th century. A company that had existed for 2 years produced consequences that lasted for half a century. What the Penn Central case reveals in the context of this channel's 34-case archive is the specific category of institutional failure whose consequences extend beyond the immediate parties to the proceeding and reshape the legal and regulatory framework within which every subsequent comparable failure will be managed. The railroad is gone. The real estate survives in various forms. Grand Central Terminal was saved. The Chapter 11 that Penn Central's failure created has been used by every major corporate bankruptcy since. If this case file changed how you evaluate the relationship between institutional failure and legal reform, subscribe to this channel because the next case examines a failure that used the tools Penn Central's collapse created and still could not survive. And in the comments, given Penn Central's management concealment of cash losses from its board and the public markets, what specific disclosure requirement in the regulatory framework of 1968 would have identified the company's deteriorating financial condition before the failure became inevitable? The case file is open. This content was developed using artificial intelligence tools as part of the research, writing, and production process. All AI-generated material was subject to human review, editorial intervention, and approval before publication. Factual claims, interpretive framing, creative direction, and final content decisions reflect human judgment throughout. This disclosure is provided in accordance with platform transparency standards for AI-assisted content.